So if you go ahead and open up your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 8. We'll be looking at a few passages there for review in just a few minutes. That's Hebrews 8. Today we are in class 14 of our study through the Epistle to the Hebrews, and we're going to be continuing the second movement of this larger textual segment that we called the Heart of Hebrews. We started into this new section last week at the start of chapter 8, and before we go into our new material today, I'd like us to briefly review some of the major points that we made from that chapter and especially highlight some of the emphasis that we had on the structure and the purpose of this larger segment of Hebrews. So at the very start of chapter 8, in verse 1, we saw that the author kind of signaled the shift to the new topic or the new framing of his argument by announcing the purpose of the entire epistle. And what was that purpose in 8:1? We have a high priest. Specifically, we have the exact kind of high priest that was described in chapter 7, verse 26. A perfect high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. What follows is nearly 3 chapters where we get the clearest, most detailed explanation of what Jesus' current priesthood means for you and me as the people of his priesthood. Now, structurally, we divided this entire section, the Heart of Hebrews, into 3 movements. I compared it to a symphony, where some of the motifs introduced early on get repeated multiple times as we go through these 3 movements. Each of them will use similar vocabulary, they'll teach similar messages, but they all add their own unique emphasis to the message of the Heart of Hebrews. There might be a portion that is stressed in one movement to a great extent, and then it's barely brought up in another one altogether. But they still cover the same topics 3 distinct times. These also had 3 subsections that we saw within each movement. Can anyone remember what those 3 subsections were that we're going to see repeated? Covenant is one of them. That's right. And there's 2 more. Sacrifice. And then where does each one start? Called it sanctuary. So each one covers 3 subtopics of sanctuary, sacrifice, and covenant. And they move through that same order. We're going to do that 3 times. That's our 3 movements through the Heart of Hebrews. That first movement, which we covered last week, is the whole of chapter 8. And it emphasized God's spoken word in the Old Testament. So where God spoke and prophesied about Christ's new priesthood and all the superiorities of it. That was called the New Promised. First, the author stated that in the Old Testament, God promised to provide a better sanctuary. All right? He promised to provide a better sanctuary. Where did God make that or imply that promise? It was not Psalm 110. That one's about the new priest that's coming, but no, it's not in the Psalms at all, but it's a different place. Sorry? Not quite in Jeremiah either. That one's going to be covenant later. This one went all the way back to Exodus, where God told Moses to build an earthly sanctuary after the pattern that he had seen on the mountain, after the blueprint of the heavenly sanctuary which Moses had seen in his visions on the mountain. The author's logic here works a lot like what we've seen elsewhere in the book. Merely by God referring to a heavenly sanctuary, revealing its existence, we already learn at that point that the earthly sanctuary was never intended to be permanent. He always had something else in mind. He always had something better in mind, something heavenly. So that was sanctuary. After that, the author stated that God promised a better ritual offering than what the Aaronite priests were able to offer under the old law. Where did he derive this prophecy from? This one's a bit harder. It's the same exact place. It is also when God said, build everything after the pattern you saw it on the mountain. Part of that instruction of the greater tabernacle was its rituals. Moses then wrote down about what the priest did, how they were to be ordained, how they were supposed to dress, and all of the offerings they were supposed to make as he had seen it on the mountain. Again, this is a prophecy of the Lord. The mere existence, reference to better offerings shows that the offerings of the Levitical priest was never meant to be permanent. And then finally, the author states that in the Old Testament, God promised to provide a better covenant. This is where we get to Jeremiah 31 now. This is the most clear-cut of all of the promises. In Jeremiah 31, it was in 31 through 34, that God says he'll make a new covenant in those days with the house of Israel, not like the old covenant that he cut with them at Sinai. And again, the main emphasis of last week is that this shows that the old covenant was never permanent. It was always intended to be replaced. And it's going to be replaced with something better. What did we read made the new covenant better than the old? This is again in Hebrews 8. It was enacted on better promises. Can anyone tell me what those promises are? We divided it into three. It's kind of arbitrary, but does anyone remember what the better promises of Jeremiah 31 are? Sorry? So the hope is going to be a result of these better promises, but Jeremiah gets a bit more detailed than that. What's accomplished in this new covenant? First is the new heart. That's right. God says he'll put his law on the people's heart, and he'll put it inside of their heart as well. So first is the law in the people's heart. What was second? Everyone will know the Lord. That's right. You no longer have to teach your brethren. People will know the Lord himself. And then there was one more at the end. He says that he will no longer remember their iniquities. He will forgive their sins. In today's class, we're going to expand on these topics, all the topics that were introduced last week and the promises, by working again through sanctuary, sacrifice, and covenant. But this time, in the second movement, we're going to move away from the prophecies of the Lord, where he said he would provide better things, to the foreshadowings of the Lord. So we're going to look at distinct examples in the Old Testament that reveal something better would come along. Not the words of God, but the actual physical objects that reveal better things are coming. And it is specifically the deficiencies of the physical objects that people had under the old law that teach us a lot about the complete sufficiencies of Christ's new law. Now, before we get going this morning, I do have some clarifications that I need to make of things that I failed to accomplish in last week's class. And this is primarily just vocabulary, and it also helps us maybe understand a bit more about the structure of how these three chapters are organized by the author. So, first is going to be Christ's priesthood. I'm going to put our main terms in red, and then maybe some synonyms or other terms that are often grouped with it in brown and lowercase next to them. Christ's priesthood is, of course, the main topic of the whole book of Hebrews, and we are now in the pinnacle of the description of Christ's priesthood. But it shares a few other names as we go through this text. So when we read about his ministry, we're still talking about his priestly ministry. When we read about the services that Christ does, it is his priestly services. All of these three chapters are about Christ's priestly role and his priestly capacity. And that includes the three subtopics that we bring up over and over again. Sanctuary. The sanctuary refers to a space, to a structure in which God will dwell among his people. And this is also where the priest is going to perform their duties and their jobs. I'm going to use the word sanctuary most often because I like it. It's generic, but it also does get across the holiness aspect of something that is sacred or sanctified. But there's, again, other words that are often used in this text that mean sanctuary. Sometimes it is going to be a tent. Sometimes it's even called a tabernacle. That tabernacle may either be earthly or heavenly. All of these things refer to the concept of God's sanctuary, the place of his dwelling and the place where the priest goes to perform their priestly duties. Among those duties is our second topic, which is sacrifices. Sacrifices is, of course, much more clear and straightforward. But I do want to clarify exactly what kind of sacrifices we're talking about most frequently throughout this text. The Old Law had all sorts of offerings in it. Some of them were thanksgiving, some of them were tithes, some of them were more oriented towards purification. And it is specifically those offerings of purification that are most relevant to our class today. And then it's those offerings for sin, which are going to be brought up near the end of our text today and will be very important in the next 2 weeks as we move forward. So when we read about sacrifices, sometimes they're also called rituals or offerings, or they're just talked about the components of the sacrifices, the blood or the flesh of either animals or of Christ himself. All of these things are the same topic of sacrifice. Finally, there's covenant. Covenant intrinsically involves people, and as we discovered last week, it involves promises. I've been using the term covenant people several times throughout this class, and I never really defined what I mean by that, but it's describing those individuals who are part of a covenant relationship with the Lord. In the Old Covenant, we tend to group that as the nation of Israel, although, of course, the boundaries were a bit more nuanced than that about who also came into the nation or how the Lord interacted with those outside the nation. But in the New Covenant, we identify this as Christians. Those who have a covenantal relationship with the Lord are God's covenant people. And then, of course, we should see the 3 promises of Jeremiah 31 as being included within the covenant: the law on the hearts, the knowledge of the Lord, and the forgiveness of sins. This total framework here of priestly ministry is how the author structures all of his comparison and contrast between the ministry of the Levites and the priestly ministry of Christ in heaven. This is going to be all of the vocabulary and structure that we're using for this heart of Hebrews. All right, so now that we've looked at some vocabulary that I failed to clarify last week, let's go ahead and move into our actual text for today. Oh, and I have one more warning. I think this class is the second longest class that we have in terms of number of verses to cover. And what that means is we're not going to cover everything. There's going to be several verses that are brought up or topics that are brought up that we probably can't get into the details of like we might wish. If you find something that we don't give adequate attention to, take comfort that since most of these themes also appear in the third movement, where we slow down a bit and we have a bit more space for conversation, hopefully we'll get to return to them and sufficiently address them at that point. So let's go ahead now and read the first 5 verses of Hebrews chapter 9 and begin the second movement of this heart of Hebrews. We're going to start with sanctuary. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. These 5 verses are pretty straightforward and simple. Their entire job, their whole role, is to remind the reader about the physical design of the Mosaic tabernacle. I'll put a very simplified diagram on the screen, but I don't want us to pay too much attention to the visual as much as we pay attention to the description that the author gives in the text. Here are the major points, the major message that we're supposed to get from the author's description. First, the sanctuary was a physical place under the Old Covenant. This means it occupied real space on this earth. It had a real geography, and it would necessarily demonstrate the relationship between geography and sanctity. Now, we've brought this up many classes ago when we talked about the roles of biblical priesthood. We said some of their jobs was to be holy and near to the Lord. At the same time, they were trying to make the people holy and near to the Lord. The physical structure of the tabernacle takes us from being just a moral abstraction about being close to the Lord in spirit to being physically, geographically closer to the Lord. As one walked closer to the older tabernacle, they were stepping into territory that was both more holy and closer to God. We're going to call this concept progression. As one progressed towards the most holy place, they progressed closer and closer to sanctity, closer and closer to God's presence on earth. That's the first concept that we need to establish from the structure of the old tabernacle. Second, the geographic progression of the tabernacle was not continuous. It has discrete divisions that delineate separate areas of both holiness and nearness to the Lord. These geographic divisions are marked with literal physical barriers. There were walls and curtains between people and God's dwelling place. So as one passed from the streets or from the camp, wherever the tabernacle was placed at various times, into the courtyard, they went from being in mundane space into a sanctified space, which had very specific sacred duties that were performed there. Again, to progress further, even closer to holiness or even closer to God, one would have to enter the tent proper. This is what we tend to call the holy place. And finally, to progress into the most extreme proximity with God's holiness and His presence, one would have to go beyond the curtain or the veil. It's a little unclear in Scripture whether or not the most holy place shared any walls at all with the holy place. Sometimes it's described as though just a veil or a screen separates the two. Most frequently in Hebrews, we read of it as a second tent or a second tabernacle inside of the outer tabernacle. So that's how I've tried to display it here. The point being is that it is very separated. You have walls on top of walls that separates God's dwelling place from the place where the people live outside of the sanctuary. The point here is that there wasn't just geographic progression as one moved into the old tabernacle, but that there were physical, literal barriers that prevented holiness and nearness to the Lord. It's these barriers that are then going to be the most pertinent topic as we move into the next few verses of Hebrews 9. So let's keep reading now in verse 6. These preparations having thus been made, meaning the tabernacle having thus been constructed, the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. But into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. In verses 6 and 7, we have this kind of ironic contrast that appears to us between the common priest and the high priest. In verse 6, what are the generic priests doing? Okay, so they are entering the holy place, and you said continually. They're doing this with regularity. What are they doing in the holy place? It's very vague. They're performing various rituals, okay? So they go in with great frequency to the outer room, and then they do their job, okay? Now in verse 7, what about the high priest? Where does he go? What regularity, and what does he do? The most holy place, once a year. So now we've really turned down the regularity to make this a rare event. And what does he do there? We get much more specific on what is accomplished there. He has to offer blood. He has to offer the blood of animals both for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. So these two sets of priests, the regular priest and the high priest, both differ in regularity, in space, and in duties. What do they have in common? This might be asking you to read my mind here, but what do they have in common in both of their actions here? They're getting closer to God. Yeah, they can't just go in as freely as they want to do. What I phrased it as is they both go into a space that is off limits. They both go into a space that is off limits to nearly the entire population. The barriers of the tabernacle are felt by all, not just the layman, but the priest. Even the high priest can barely go into the most holy place, and only once a year. This is a structure which defines everybody's relationship with the Lord, and that is intentional. We read that this is by design. Who designed the tabernacle in this way? In verse 8, we read very specifically, it's the Holy Spirit who was revealing a message by the design of the tabernacle. Essentially, that tabernacle was designed, as I've titled it, as an architectural parable. It was intended to teach a lesson merely by its structure, merely by the way that it was put together on earth. Under the old sanctuary, if you wanted to come closer to God's holiness and presence, that's too bad. There are literal barriers. There are literal separations between you and God. Every ancient Israelite and God-fearer who came in to see the tabernacle could learn about their separation between themselves and God simply by looking at the design of the tabernacle. Again, we read this many classes ago, but the purpose of the tabernacle was so that God could come and dwell among his people. That is why it was built in the first place. One could just look at the tabernacle and see that didn't come true. God's purpose for the tabernacle remained unfulfilled. He didn't dwell with his people. There were walls upon walls between him and his people. This is why the old tabernacle had its shape and structure and architectural design. It was intended to teach the lesson of separation between God and his people. That first clause of verse 9 summarizes this well. And I'd encourage you to read that statement as the Mosaic tabernacle is symbolic for that present age. Various translations do better or worse at clarifying exactly what the present age is of verse 9, but I do want to clarify this is not talking about our present age, or even the present age of the Hebrew author. The present age is that age which we've been discussing for the whole first 10 verses here. It's the age when the tabernacle was present. That's the present age which it represents. So, while the design of the earthly sanctuary symbolized the separation of God and his people, we get to read a bit further now about why these barriers existed and why they persisted all the way through the old sanctuary's lifespan, even despite repeated rituals of the common priest and the very special rituals of the high priest. In verse 9, what is the result of the earthly tabernacle and all of its regular and rare offerings? What's the result? That's right. It failed to perfect the conscience of the worshipers or of the participants in the ceremonies. Now, we've talked about perfection several times through Hebrews already, but this is the first time that we've seen the word conscience pop up. We're going to keep seeing it a few more times in this chapter and in the next one, so I think we should spend just a moment clarifying what we mean by conscience. When we use the word conscience in our vocabulary today, what do we typically mean by that? Sorry? Okay, a moral governor, some type of guide. That's right, something that helps us make moral decisions. I have another meaning as well. I do think it has at least two in our common usage. Okay. Built-in restriction, I'm going to put that as a governor as well, so it helps us set boundaries.
It either affirms or convicts what you're doing.
The conviction aspect, I think, is also maybe a second usage of how we talk about conscience today. It's a self-judgment of moral guilt or innocence. So we don't just talk about our conscience guiding us, we talk about our conscience bothering us if we know we've done something wrong. Okay?
Like in contrasting, I know one only covered and moved your guilt forward.
Okay.
And under this one, it cleanses. I know it cleanses instead of covering.
Right. We'll get to talk about the complete sufficiency of the cleansing of the guilt a bit later in class today, but especially next week as we move into chapter 10. But you are right. But I want us to talk about the definition of conscience as it's used here in the book of Hebrews in particular. I would say that sometimes I've heard verse 9 and a few other passages in Hebrews a little lopsidedly explained as primarily meaning the feeling of guilt or just the feeling of the worshipers. And that would lead verse 9 to say something like, according to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot take away the guilty feelings of the worshiper. While I do think that might be a true statement, I do think it misses the point that the author is making repeatedly throughout the book of Hebrews. So I'd encourage you here to read conscience, not as just meaning right moral feeling, but as the desire and implementation of right moral action. So I'm going to explain what I mean a bit more, and we're going to do that by looking at a few other passages that also use this word and maybe help us understand a bit more about the author's full intention of conscience. So first, conscience is paired with perfection. I said that we've already seen perfection several times throughout the book of Hebrews. What does perfection or perfecting usually come up with throughout Hebrews so far? Okay, so we know that it means that there's a lack of flaws, that's right, but there's a specific person that perfection shows up with all throughout Hebrews. It is with Christ himself, that's right. He is described as perfect or perfected on several occasions. When the author has referred to Jesus as perfected in these instances, he's not been saying that Jesus felt good about himself or felt innocent about himself, but that Jesus was morally perfect, that he did act in a morally good way. If the usage of perfection stays consistent from how we've seen it so far through Hebrews, we would expect this passage in chapter 9 as well to also be addressing one's moral state and moral actions, not just their moral feelings. We get more clarification at the end of the book. If you'll go ahead and turn to Hebrews chapter 13 really quick. We'll just read a passage from there. In Hebrews 13, in verse 18, this is when the author is kind of giving his final farewell and last instructions for his audience. He writes in 13:18, "Pray for us, for we are sure that we have a clear conscience, desiring to act honorably in all things." Note how the author presents clear conscience in parallel with the desire for honorable action. In Hebrews, when we read about a perfect conscience or a clear conscience, we're not as concerned with feelings of guilt, but with the desire and the execution of right moral actions. This pops up all over Scripture. In 2 Corinthians 1, when Paul is defending himself against the slander that some of the false teachers are saying about him during his absence, he defends himself by saying, "For I boast in this, the testimony of our conscience, that we behaved in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity." So the sincerity addresses his desire, and the behavior addresses his action in the world. Paul offers this same defense to both the Sanhedrin and also to Felix during his later trials, or during his trials. He says, "So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man." If Paul's claim to have a clear conscience simply means he didn't feel guilty, and that's a very weak or even a non-defense. we must understand biblical conscience as addressing one's desire and execution of right moral action. So now, returning to Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 9, when we read that the old tabernacle and its offerings could not perfect the conscience of the worshipers, the author is saying it could not help them desire and execute right moral actions. To maybe phrase this in other ways, it could not help them be holy and near to God. It had barriers built in. It demonstrated all of the insufficiencies and separation of the people's desire for holiness and their execution of holiness. That's what the old tabernacle did. It demonstrated the barriers and separation. Now, on the other hand, in verse 10, we do read that it was effective at some things. It couldn't make people's conscience pure. It couldn't help them desire and execute right moral action. What did it accomplish in verse 10? The cleansing of flesh. There's a few other things listed with that too. It affected the food and drink, washings, and then the bodies or the flesh of the worshipers. Sorry? All very much outward, and some of them very external to us as well. I want us to note how weak and anemic this sounds in comparison to the promises that we just read in Hebrews chapter 8. Those promises from Jeremiah 31. The old tabernacle completely failed to install that new heart which was full of God's law. It completely failed to allow for nearness or complete knowledge, personal knowledge of God. And as we'll see later, it also fails to accomplish the forgiveness of sins. For worshipers to have the promises of Jeremiah 31, for worshipers to have a purified, perfected conscience, they must embrace the time of Reformation, Christ's Reformation. So let's read about that now, starting in verse 11 through 14. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? The time of Reformation happens when Christ appeared as the Christian high priest. But Christ has not appeared in the earthly sanctuary, in that old sanctuary that we've been talking about for the entire class this morning. He appears in the superior heavenly sanctuary. And this begins our transition to the second topic of this movement, the sacrifice of Christ. If the old sanctuary required offerings in order to purify both the structure and the people, what is required for the superior heavenly sanctuary? Sorry? A superior heavenly sacrifice. That's exactly right. And what is that superior offering in verse 12? Sorry? It's Christ, specifically his own blood. The superior nature of human blood, I should say, is probably just assumed throughout a lot of this section of Hebrews, especially the blood of God incarnate. That is never explicitly stated for us, but we're supposed to assume that human blood is better than animal blood. But verses 13 and 14 do give us a brief argument from the lesser to greater in order to emphasize the results of Christ's superior offering. So first, let's talk about the lesser. Despite all of the insufficiencies of the old sacrifices, what did they accomplish? Okay, so a ritual purification of persons, especially the flesh of those persons. That's right. How do we know that this actually happened? How do we know that it was effective at ritually purifying people? Okay, so we have the specific rituals such as the Day of Atonement, but how do we know those rituals did anything? Sorry? Okay, God said that they would. He showed it too, because we have events like the Day of Atonement. We have events where the priests, remember just back early in this chapter, they go regularly into the holy place and they didn't get struck down dead. Even the high priest, once a year, could go share a room with God, and he came out of that alive. Most of the time, we believe. And so that's still incredible. That is still, I would say, even miraculous. We're supposed to understand that the old sacrifices and the rituals, they were not useless. They accomplished a miraculous level of purification of the people and of their flesh. It's amazing that it made people pure enough to spend time near God. But as amazing as the results of the animal blood is, shouldn't we expect something greater from human blood? Shouldn't we expect something incredibly far superior from the blood of God incarnate? What miraculous thing does Christ's blood accomplish for all Christians? It purifies our conscience. In verse 12, we also read it secures an eternal redemption, but that one in verse 14 is the conclusion of the matter. This one finally purifies our conscience. And again, notice what conscience means in this verse. Christ doesn't just purify your conscience so that you no longer feel guilty. He purifies your conscience to remove you from dead works so that you can serve the living God. What we're talking about here is grace of a miraculous variety. Christ's blood changes Christians to become effective and to become servants in a way that the old blood never could. Whereas those could never make a people who desired and executed on righteous moral action, Christ's offering doesn't just make us feel better, it really changes us to become better. That is the all-sufficiency of Christ's blood for his people. Now, before we move on, we're quickly running out of time. We need to talk about why this is relevant, why this is important for the original audience of Hebrews. Remember, based on all the context clues that we see throughout the book, this is written to a church who was facing some time of persecution, some time of trial, and deep uncertainty. They were questioning whether or not they could put up with all of the problems they were facing or whether they would fall into apostasy. And it's exactly during these times of suffering, trial, or uncertainty that a Christian most needs to meditate on their high priest and on exactly what he is accomplishing for you. He has cleansed you. He has changed you in a way that no other offering could. He has purified your conscience to where you no longer have to serve dead works, but you can now serve the living God. That is why this is important for the audience of Hebrews. They need to know that their priest helps them in a way that nothing else could. And now they can endure and serve in a way that they never could before. And of course, our involvement with the blood of Christ's offering brings us to the final subtopic of this movement, which is the covenant, which is sealed with Christ's blood. So let's very quickly try to cover 8 verses in the last 5 minutes of class. So starting in verse 15. Therefore, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who were called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law has been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and he sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. In this last section, the author is continuing to talk about the superior nature of Christ's blood and Christ's sacrifice, but we're transitioning again to how that inaugurates a superior covenant. Specifically, as we see in verse 15, this covenant redeems people from their transgressions. Remember that prophecy, that promise of Jeremiah 31, verse 34, that God would forgive their iniquities. He would remember their sins no more. Here in verse 15, the author announces, Jesus' covenant is the fulfillment of the promise of Jeremiah 31. And that's not all. It's not just a prophecy that is being fulfilled here. It's all of the covenants of the Old Testament. They all foreshadow, they point forward to the ultimate fulfillment of Christ's own covenant. This foreshadowing effect is most clearly stated for us in verses 16 through 18, which brings me to now have a period of complaints. Most modern translations have really dropped the ball in how they have translated verses 16 and 17. We've been reading a single Greek word over and over again throughout the book of Hebrews, and it pops up a ton in this chapter. And every single time, translators use the word covenant to put that into English. In theory, that Greek word could sometimes mean a few other things. Testament would be an appropriate translation, as long as we view it as a synonym for covenant. And on occasions, there are some extant records, especially in like Latin Hellenistic cultures and in business settings, of using it to mean a will, like a last will and testament, of how someone would divide their inheritance to their survivors. But Hebrews wasn't written in a business setting to people in a Latin Hellenistic culture. Remember from class 1, this is written to Hellenistic Jews. To the author and to the original audience, this word would have meant what it meant in the Septuagint and what it has been translated as in 95% of its occurrences in Hebrews. It means covenant, not will. So I'd encourage us all to read verses 16 through 18 as talking about covenants and not last wills and testaments. In verse 16, for where a covenant is involved, the death of the one who made the covenant must be established. For a covenant takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. The reason that I believe most translators end up using will is because when you read covenant, this gets really confusing really fast. You're telling me covenants involve the death of the one who made it? You're telling me covenants only take effect at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive? And the answer is yes, at least ritually, yes. The author is clearly stating what was already known to all those who were familiar with the covenant system of the ancient Near East. A covenant requires the ritual death of the participants. We don't have time to talk about some of the historical examples of how we know that this was a common practice, but I want to bring up two occasions where we know that this happens, at least in Scripture. The first is Genesis 15, when God makes his covenant with Abraham, that he will give him a nation, that they will have a land, and that he will then have a seed that blesses all the nations of the earth. God first instructs Abraham to go kill a bunch of animals, to set their body parts, cut in half in a row, and then God would walk among those body parts while he made his covenant to Abraham. The imagery that he's portraying there is that the death of the animals would represent his death, God's own death, in the event that he failed to keep his covenant. The death of animals represented the death of the participants, and it showed both the somber nature of the covenant and also the consequences of what would happen if you failed to keep it. The only real covenant-making rituals we have today tend to happen in wedding ceremonies, and you can imagine how much more serious those would be if we made the bride and groom kill a bunch of animals, pour the blood on themselves, stand amongst the animals, carcass, and say, this is what will happen to me if I am unfaithful in the vows that I am promising to you now. And that's what God did in Genesis 15. And again, we see it in Exodus 24, which is quoted here in the book of Hebrews. Moses killed some animals, and he took half the blood to purify the furniture in the sanctuary, and the other half he put on all the people, because that's their own blood. That is their death. That is what shows that they have entered into a covenant with the Lord. This precedent of how ancient covenants were formed, especially covenants with God, shows that it must involve the ritual death of the participants. And of course, the death and the blood that inaugurates the new covenant here in Hebrews 9 is infinitely superior to the animal blood of the old. The new covenant people of God, Christians, have been sealed by God's own blood. And this is what finally brings about the fulfillment of Jeremiah 31. Finally, we are redeemed from all our transgressions. Now, as we end, I want us to circle back to where we closed last week's class. We noted during those last few minutes last week that God had promised forgiveness of sins in the new covenant, and that seemed to imply that there was not a forgiveness of sins in the old. In this second movement, that confusion seems to return. We see in verse 15 that the old covenant did not result in redemption. Instead, it resulted in transgressions, which could only be redeemed by the offering of Christ. We're going to spend the next 2 weeks in movement 3 of the heart of Hebrews, and I've titled this third movement, The New Explained. We're going to finally get some answers as we move forward about whether or not people who lived before Christ could have their sins forgiven, about whether or not they could know the Lord, about whether or not they could have his law in their hearts. We're going to receive our most complete explanation of the miraculous extent of Christ's accomplishments as high priest. There are handouts on both of the tables in the back. Please grab those if you'd like to have the paper copies. If not, I'll get an email very soon with the study guide for next week's class. Please read ahead on that so we can all be prepared together. Thank you so much for your attention.